And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening here with me in New York. Well, once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Alas, another somewhat somber episode dealing with the passing of a legend. We recently talked about John Candy, who was just 43 when he died. But Stanley Kubrick had lived a full life when he passed on this day, 1999, at 70. He had gotten more out of life in those 70 years than anybody could possibly have foreseen for him, although, as a child, he was what used to be called gifted and talented. There were rumors that his IQ was as high as Einstein's, as high as Curie, as high as Oppenheimer. Stanley Kubrick's IQ was supposedly close to 200. He was one of those people, whatever he put his mind to, he was going to not just be great at, he was going to make people who were great at it look like they were rank amateurs. Stanley Kubrick was born in the Bronx and grew up there. Early pictures of him show a playfulness of spirit, but also a fierce intensity. And he started making a good living at an age that you'd say, well, that can't be right. But he had so much ability. He took pictures for Look magazine. I think he was 15 when they hired him. 15. And we're not talking about a social media era where a very young person can go viral and suddenly start making a shit ton of money. And that's not a judgment. That's a reality of the day that we are in right now. But Kubrick had some samples, and he had work. He had still photographs that suggested otherworldly talent. So Look magazine, which at the time had an enormous circulation, almost as much of a circulation as Life magazine, for example, hired him, and just his photography has been shown at galleries around the world. He would be famous if all he did, if his career was simply a guy taking pictures, like an Ansel Adams, for example. But Kubrick, with that enormous vision and ability to optimize whatever equipment he was using to get the max value from it, he was able to move to cinema. And the early work of Kubrick, films like Fear and Desire, he didn't really have much of a budget to work with. But he was somebody who already knew what he wanted to achieve with each individual shot. Nothing was left to chance, and if he had an idea of how he wanted the frame rate, or he wanted to play around with speeds and whatnot, he would tell the cinematographer, the director of photography, what to do. And there was a famous story which showed just how resolute he was, even as a very young man just cutting his teeth in the business, where in theory, somebody could have kind of ratted on him and said, this Kubrick kid is a fucking idiot. Don't hire him if you ask me. He sucks. He had an issue, I think it was on The Killing. That's kind of a racetrack caper movie, which was his last, like, smaller film, but it did have Sterling Hayden, who had been a big star, and Kubrick later used him in Dr. Strangelove. But in that movie, there's a moment in the film where Kubrick told the director of photography, I'd like you to recalibrate this. He had a very technical explanation to the director of photography, how he wanted him to shoot this quick sequence. It was probably only about 15 seconds. He told the guy how he wanted to shoot. The director of photography, a veteran, thought Kubrick was wet behind the ears, fucking punk kid. I'm going to shoot this the way I want to. He's not going to know the difference because he's just a fucking kid. So the director of photography shot it the way he wanted to. And when Kubrick ran it back and he was looking through it, you look at pictures of Kubrick in his 20s and you look at the Kubrick stare. And he used that in a movie. If you Google Kubrick stare, you're not going to get pictures of Stanley Kubrick. You're going to get pictures of Jack Nicholson. You're going to get pictures of Malcolm McDowell. And you're going to get pictures of Vincent D'Onofrio doing the Kubrick stare. But he had the 1,000-yard stare. And when young Stanley Kubrick looked at, I guess they call them rushes, but he looked at this 15 seconds or whatever it was worth of film, and he knew the director of photography had not done what he told him to do. Bro, you're working for him. What the fuck, man? Didn't get angry. He didn't make a scene in front of the cast and crew. He told the guy, hey, I want to talk to you for a minute, just as he normally would, just as any director confers with the director of photography. Kubrick took the guy aside, and maybe he was 22 at the time. Was he 23, 24? I don't know how old he was at this particular juncture with this story. But he told the guy, if you ever do that again, you're fired. Don't fuck with me. I think that was actually the phrase that he used, don't fuck with me. I've given you what I want. I know you can achieve the shot. Let's make the fucking movie, man. Let's go. There were no more problems for the rest of the shoot. Now, there are certain films in Kubrick's filmography where he made a lot of movies that are controversial. Let's put it that way. In fact, with the possible exception of Barry Lyndon, every film of Kubrick's kind of main filmography, starting with Dr. Strangelove or Lolita, every film from a certain point of view, you can look at it and say, this is controversial. This was very controversial. This was very polarizing. This is still polarizing to this day. Stephen King has never fully embraced The Shining. He's had his moments, and King has recently said, because of what Mike Flanagan did with Dr. Sleep, he said, I feel like Stanley's movie plays better now because of what Mike was able to do with Dr. Sleep. I now hate The Shining less. I don't know if that was an exact quote, but King kind of fucks around and jokes around. But he's never really been a fan of Kubrick's film. He felt the miniseries from the 90s with Steven Weber was a kind of more accurate representation of what he was going for in the original novel. Now, most film fans don't agree with that. There are people, let's say under 30, that would have The Shining in their top 10 horror films. But that's the only film of Stanley Kubrick that they have seen. From Lolita, Dr. Strangelove forward, every movie that Stanley made after that is either pioneering, groundbreaking, artistically jaw-dropping, or in the immortal words of Chevy Chase, answers D, all three. Because Lolita took Nabokov's very challenging novel, very difficult material, mid-50s professor, has a crush on a inappropriately underage girl. We really made a movie about that back then? Yeah. Kubrick said, let's do it. Rock and roll. Dr. Strangelove is a black comedy adaptation of the book Failsafe, a really good book. And there's the movie Failsafe with Walter Matthau and Henry Fonda. Great movie. But Dr. Strangelove takes the concept of nuclear Armageddon and turns it into a comedy. Are you kidding me? No. He was very serious. And Sterling Hayden's character, an absolute riot. The guy is reading his lines and he's saying stuff that doesn't make any sense. The Russians are robbing our bodies of precious fluids. What? Now, we could criticize the guy, but if he ends up starting World War III, oops. Dr. Strangelove is a movie that has arguably the single greatest line of dialogue in the history of movies. Now, that's really saying something, because you could go back to Casablanca, here's looking at you, kid, and then the other one in Casablanca, which was not Stanley Kubrick, it was Michael Curtiz in 1943, I think, but another one of the greatest lines of dialogue ever is when Humphrey Bogart is asked by one of the characters, how did you get to Casablanca, Rick? Why'd you come here? He goes, I came here for the waters. The Claude Rains character. I came here for the waters. Claude Rains looks at me and says, you came here for the waters. We're in a desert. And Bogart, as only he can, goes, I was misinformed. In Dr. Strangelove, there is a moment in the film where Peter Sellers, President Merkin Muffley, what a great name. At least I think that, was it Merkin or Mervin? Whatever it is, it's not really a very presidential name, if I'm allowed to talk a little politics here on the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. It's not a great name for a president. Spoiler alert. So George C. Scott, fantastic as a general. He has a couple of unbelievable lines himself. But the war room descends into chaos because nobody knows what to do. We have accidentally, not really accidentally, but we tell the Russians we've accidentally sent our nukes over there and we don't really want you to attack us back, but we know you have to do something. So it descends into chaos. And Peter Sellers says, gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. And if that isn't a level of sublime, a level of greatness, of magnificence, I can't think of another line of dialogue better than, gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. Who taught you how to do this stuff? Remember those old after-school specials? Father yelling at his son because he sees the kid has weed. Who taught you how to do this stuff? You, all right? I learned by watching you. So Dr. Strangelove, top 5 greatest black comedies ever made. Nobody would say otherwise. In certain quarters, Kubrick's most famous film is 2001: A Space Odyssey, where he takes a crazy story by Arthur C. Clarke, and I don't even know how you would start the process of even getting the idea of how to adapt a book as dense as that. You know, the joke with Woody Allen when he did Love and Death is that he was taking the book War and Peace. Was that Tolstoy? I think that was Tolstoy. I don't think it was Dostoevsky. But you take War and Peace. Well, how do you adapt it? You turn it into a comedy. And you make it 90 minutes. You just kind of cut everything out except a couple of little beats here or there. That's how you do it. Well, somehow, Kubrick was able to make this grand space epic with science fiction elements, with effects work and practical effects, which they still hold up. 58 years later, 57 years later, the effects work is staggering. The concepts in the film are staggering. And just to give you an idea, because when you're in the movie business and you have contemporary filmmakers, such as, Christopher Nolan, Greta Gerwig, whoever it might be, if you don't think that they idolize, that they model some of what they do after Stanley Kubrick, well, they do. Spoiler alert, they do. Not so much Tarantino. Tarantino has said a lot of things that I find to be a little bit weird about both Kubrick and especially Hitchcock. But Christopher Nolan is the closest approximation to Stanley Kubrick in terms of the static nature of the shots and how he's able to hold close-ups. And he's talked about, I think he believes that 2001 is Kubrick's masterpiece. But he also loves A Clockwork Orange, Eyes Wide Shut, loves his entire filmography. But in the movie Barbie, which a lot of you have seen, maybe you haven't seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, that opening sequence with the girls and the dolls, and then you have Barbie herself standing a very certain way. If you wonder, this is a weird scene. What are they doing here? And then throwing the doll in the air. It is a shot-for-shot reconstruction of the beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey. That is what you call catnip for people like me, for film geeks, for people who have made movies a significant area of study, not just something that we like to shoot the shit every once in a while. To be fair, I don't have 2001: A Space Odyssey in my Kubrick top 3. I appreciate it. It is an extraordinary film, but it does not grab me the way a lot of his other works do. I see it from a more clinical perspective. And if I'm being honest, do you know how many times that I have watched Orson Welles' Citizen Kane? And by the way, Stanley Kubrick is a peer of Orson Welles. Like, this guy is on the top level of all-time greatest filmmakers around the world. Yasujiro Ozu, Kenzo Mizoguchi, Michelangelo Antonioni. He's up there. There are people that would put him number one. Most influential filmmaker who ever lived, Stanley Kubrick. It used to be Orson Welles, but Orson Welles unfortunately didn't have much of a career because he got fucked so badly by the studio system. But I don't love Citizen Kane as a cinematic experience. I can say, oh my God, this movie does so many different things that nobody had even attempted before. Wells figured out how to optimize what was possible with 1941 Panavision. It wasn't called Panavision, but the movie cameras of the day. What could they achieve with sound? What could he achieve with creative editing? What could he achieve with ellipses? A lot of things that other people hadn't even attempted. The deep focus photography with his cinematographer, Greg Toland. I appreciate Citizen Kane. Respect its place in history. Don't enjoy watching the film. It's not that exciting. I feel the same about 2001: A Space Odyssey. There is so much information in virtually every shot of that movie. And one thing with Kubrick, in all of his films, there is a lot of detail on the outer edges of the frame. He never just has a shot where it's just an actor and there's nothing else going on. He wants to engage the senses as much as possible. It was something that you can see throughout his work. And it doesn't necessarily make him that much different, because I've said pretty much the same thing about Ridley Scott. But it is something to keep in mind, what he's trying to achieve, what he does achieve. His next film is what I consider to be his masterpiece, A Clockwork Orange. Technically a science fiction film. Star Wars is also a science fiction film, right? Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not another Spielberg. Science fiction film. AI, science fiction film. But it's not that kind of sci-fi. It's postmodern. It's intellectual sci-fi, and a lot of it is science fiction because it's set in the future. It's set in what's probably supposed to be 1990. The film came out in 71. And that, to this day, is still the most controversial film that Kubrick made. It got an X rating. I don't think it was legally allowed to be screened in regular theaters in England for 2 decades, or maybe it was that Kubrick pulled it because they wanted him to edit the film. I don't remember the particulars, but that is a hugely controversial film. And 54 years later, or 53 plus years later to be more precise, because it came out December of 1971, there are people picking up this film for the first time that can't believe that anyone was allowed to make a movie like this. You would have a lot of trouble getting this one through the censors today. You'd be able to release it. You could go different pathways, send it to streaming. There's always ways around it. Whereas when the MPAA was pretty much running shit, sometimes filmmakers' hands were tied. The MPAA was a good idea. It was actually an advancement from what they used to call the production code behind that Joe Breen and the Legion of Decency and all that fucking nonsense. The MPAA was a good idea, but there was a lot of creative freedom that was unfortunately suppressed in the name of, well, it's just a rating service to help parents. That's just a crock. I mean, I don't remember getting angry listening to people explain this to me when I was a kid, but I think about it now. It feels worse now than it did when I was just a kid at New York University and people were explaining to me, yeah, the Legion of Decency was ridiculous, and the production code was a crock, and the MPAA, all they do is censor artistic expression, and not cool. But A Clockwork Orange is in my opinion, his best work. Something that it reaches a level of transcendence that there are very few other films in history that have been able to do that. And there is that stare from Malcolm McDowell in the movie. Close-ups of him snarling, sneering, smiling, engaging in a bit of the old ultra-violence. It's an experience you can't passively watch. A Clockwork Orange. His next film, which was Barry Lyndon, that's a movie I don't like. I respect it. He burned more than 1 million candles. He wanted to use only natural light because it's a period piece set in the 18th century. He didn't really want to use any tricks to light things, so you have indoor scenes where there's literally thousands and thousands of candles in the scene to give it enough light. Most filmmakers cheat. James Cameron even joked about this with Titanic. He said, you know, if I'm being honest about it, and I'm giving you a goof if you want to call this a goof, but when Jack and Rose are in the water and everybody is out there in the water, spoiler alert, freezing to death, I got to light it somehow. Was it true to what really happened? It can't be, because there wouldn't have been nearly as much light as what I had to portray in the film. But sometimes you got to cut a little corner. And Barry Lyndon is a film that, at New York University Film School, the chairman of the department, William Simon, he said it was Kubrick's masterpiece. He thought that Barry Lyndon was one of the 3 or 4 greatest films in the history of cinema, up to 1996, that is. I don't know if his opinion changed since then. He thought the film was just, it was so brilliantly constructed, the costume design, the production design, the way that Kubrick matches the music, the sound. He thought it was a level above anything else that Stanley had ever done. It's a very long movie, and I would say that it's a pretty difficult watch. That is not one that I would recommend to kind of neophytes with Kubrick. The first film I would recommend them watch would be either The Shining, which was his follow-up to Barry Lyndon, or Full Metal Jacket. I feel like Full Metal Jacket is his most accessible film because it does play like a lot of other war movies, even though Stanley's going at it from an entirely different angle. It is not a combat film, but as far as showing the futility of war, and I forgot to mention his first, my God, Paths of Glory with Kirk Douglas. What an extraordinary film. That's about World War I, and that has a lot of parallels with Full Metal Jacket, and not just because they're both war films, but they get into the idiocy of it all, the futility of it all, and how sometimes your greatest enemy and a source of terror, if you will, it might just be a 12-year-old kid who happens to have access to a rifle and knows how to shoot. That might be your greatest adversary. It's just, there's so much in Full Metal Jacket that makes you sad, disturbed, angry. And what the fuck were we doing there in the first place? Like, what were we doing in Vietnam? What were we doing there? And that movie does beat you over the head with that. But also the kind of horror of war and the horror of trying to transform young men into little more than cold-blooded killing machines. Because that's what you have to do when you're in combat. You can't have mercy. We've seen it. We know it. And Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan gets into this too. If air is still in his lungs and he could still deliver a message, we got to keep shooting. Can't let him get out. We got to take this guy down. It doesn't matter that he's wounded. I'm going to put another shot at him. And it's horrible, but it's the reality and the futility of war. But yeah, Full Metal Jacket, I think, is just, it's an incredible film. If you're asking me, is it my favorite war movie? It might be my favorite war movie. It does so many things. It's such a challenging film while still being extremely entertaining, particularly the opening boot camp sequence. No matter how many times you watch it, it is still riveting, mesmerizing cinema. The thing with Kubrick, though, you look at the filmography starting, like I say, Paths of Glory, I think, was the first film of his where he was sort of an A-level director. He was still in his 20s at the time. That's how much of a whiz-bang. And until the day he died, Kirk Douglas just heaped enormous levels of praise on Kubrick. He thought Kubrick was a genius. He didn't think there was any that people just talked him up. He's not that great. He bought the hype. He didn't think that there was any hype. And Jack Nicholson talked about very similar things, where he said, when Stanley passed, he said, everyone pretty much acknowledges that Stanley was the man, but I still feel like that underrates him. So even Jack thought that Kubrick, despite being on the exalted level and maybe at the top echelon of greatest filmmakers who ever lived, he still felt that Kubrick was even better than that. He had more to say as an artist than even that. He had a lot of projects that just didn't happen for one reason or another. In the 70s, he tried to mount a Napoleon film. It was probably going to be similar to what Ridley Scott did with Joaquin Phoenix, not entirely successful. I don't think that he was using the same source material. I'm not sure about that. I didn't look that deeply into Ridley's film. I wasn't that interested in seeing it. But Kubrick had a bunch of projects that didn't happen. after Full Metal Jacket. And one of them was AI, which Spielberg ended up making after Stanley passed. And to be fair, Kubrick had told Steven when, because they were friends, they didn't see each other that often, but they used to communicate via fax and phone calls. They were talking every day apparently. But Kubrick tried to mount AI in about 1991 or 92, and it was going to star Joseph Mazzello, who Spielberg used in Jurassic Park, instead of what ended up being Haley Joel Osment for Spielberg. And Warner Brothers was convinced it would be prohibitively expensive, and as much as they loved Kubrick and they knew that he would make a good movie, they thought they were going to lose $100 million, and they couldn't take the risk. So he did a ton of work on AI, and he had to put the project to the side. Then he had the Aryan Papers, which was, it probably would have been a good movie. It's about a young aunt who tries to get her Jewish niece out of occupied territory so that she doesn't end up in a fucking gas chamber. And Kubrick worked on that and worked and worked and worked. And when Schindler's List came out, he just became convinced that it was too similar and he didn't want to do anything with any sort of idea that he was kind of stepping on Spielberg's coattails. So he abandoned that project too. And then the professor at NYU I mentioned, William Simon, in about 1995, he said that he had, I mean, it's almost insane that this guy was friends with Kubrick, but he had been in communication with Kubrick. And Kubrick basically was going to make a movie that ended up getting produced a number of years later called Perfume Story of a Murderer. But I don't think he spent more than a couple of months on that before he abandoned that particular project. And then he landed on the Arthur Schnitzler novel Traumnovelle, or Dream Story. And that was his final film, what became Eyes Wide Shut, starring Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. And there's a lot of stories, and Nicole has talked about the experience, and Tom Cruise has done nothing but also shower praise on Kubrick and talk about, as difficult as it may have been, if I had not taken the opportunity to work with Stanley, I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. And the thing is, Cruise was still a very young man. He was 34 when he started principal photography on Eyes Wide Shut. And think about it. Eyes Wide Shut came out July of 1999. Principal photography began as Tom was promoting Jerry Maguire. He started shooting it within a week or 2 weeks maximum when he completed. And when Jerry Maguire was through the process, because I think Jerry Maguire came out in November of 96. And principal photography, as far as I can remember, on Eyes Wide Shut began in October of 96. So Cruise was working on the film while he was doing Letterman and Leno to promote Jerry Maguire. Because if you notice, his look is very similar. He's the same age. And that was an extremely difficult production. Harvey Keitel either quit or got fired. I believe the apocryphal story that he got fired. If you Google it, you won't believe what you find. Why did Harvey Keitel get fired from Eyes Wide Shut? Because he claims he quit. I like to think that the apocryphal story, which deals with Harvey Keitel's DNA ending up on Nicole Kidman, I like to believe that the apocryphal story is what actually happened. But you can kind of figure that out, and you can surmise for yourself if you think that's a crock of shit, or if you think it's so crazy it probably happened, because nobody would make up a story as nuts as that. But Eyes Wide Shut is, I think, holds the record for the longest continuous production of a major Hollywood feature. It was in production for at least 2 years. And part of that was the fact that they had to reshoot whatever scenes that Keitel had shot. They replaced him with Sidney Pollack, a fantastic filmmaker who was also a really good film actor. And Eyes Wide Shut got good reviews, but it didn't get great reviews. And there were a lot of critics that felt the film simply missed the mark. It wasn't quite worthy of Kubrick's talents. And the film was very long. There didn't seem to be enough story for a 2.5+ hour movie. Now, I saw it in theaters the day it opened. I liked it. I didn't love it. I have seen it 3 times since, and now I think that it is a masterpiece. It is on par with Stanley's best works. I wouldn't put it in the top 3. The top 3 are on lockdown, are Full Metal Jacket, A Clockwork Orange, and I got to put 2001: A Space Odyssey and Doctor Strangelove, kind of tied. But Eyes Wide Shut is a really good movie, and it was a box office hit mostly because of Tom Cruise, but enough people saw it and recommended it to their friends. It ended up grossing, I think, well over 3 times its production cost. It was a significant box office hit for Warner Brothers. But Stanley unfortunately passed apparently the day after submitting what was his final cut to the studios. And it was said that he died of natural causes, and many believe he simply worked himself to death. He was so feverish to get the film completed and get a cut to the studio, he didn't take good enough care of himself, and he died aged only 70 on March 7th, 1999. It's still sad that he's gone, but his legacy of greatness, if you say that it's unparalleled to this day, I'm not going to take issue with it. You want to say that Tarantino's filmography eclipses his? Okay. You want to say that Orson Welles is still a more important figure, or Christopher Nolan is on his way to eclipsing his idol Kubrick? Can't take issue with that. But if I'm asked the question, who do I think is the greatest filmmaker in the history of cinema? My answer is Stanley Kubrick. Gone 26 years today. This has been episode 462 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Friday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.